Thank you all for coming today. My name is Jasmine Kasnovadine, and I work with Unite Oregon, a community-based organization that helps immigrants, refugees, and people of color. We are gathered here to discuss the Joint Terrorism Task Force, also known as the JTTF, and its involvement with Portland Police Bureau. Portland City Council is slated to hear the JTTF annual report tomorrow, Wednesday, January 26th, during the morning session. The reports have been required since 2019, when Portland Police Bureau and the Joint Terrorism Task Force began the new partnership on a case-by-case basis. Wednesday will be the first time since 2019 that the public will be allowed to speak during the council's hearing. Unite Oregon has a long history of opposing the Portland Police Bureau's involvement with the FBI-run task force because of its impacts on the communities we serve. Others who you will hear from tomorrow include Unite Oregon, ACLU of Oregon, Attorney Brandon Mayfield, Portland Japanese American Citizens League, 350 PDX, CARE Oregon, Voice of Peace Portland, Portland Cop Watch, and League of Women Voters of Portland. Today, we will be hearing from ACLU, 350 PDX, Brandon Mayfield, Portland Japanese American Citizens League. Following their statements, we will have a Q&A. I would like to first invite Marina Garcia Mendina from ACLU.
Thank you, Jasmine. Hi, everyone. I'm Mariana Garcia Medina, she, her pronouns, Senior Policy Associate with the ACLU of Oregon. As we all know, the FBI has a long history of civil rights abuses, including surveillance of lawful First Amendment activity. They have surveilled and interrogated peaceful political activists and protesters, inappropriately justifying those actions by characterizing them as lawful public protests as potential domestic terrorism. Time and time again, the FBI has used invasive and unconstitutional surveillance tactics in the name of counterterrorism and national security. These kinds of surveillance operations harm community trust, disproportionately impacting historically disenfranchised communities, including BIPOC and Muslim communities. And they also chill and punish protected political speech and do not advance public safety. The JTTF continues to operate under a veil of secrecy with very little oversight and transparency. The true extent and breadth of the JTTF activities are unknown. The lack of oversight and transparency also make it very difficult for us to know how and when rights violations have occurred and if they have involved Portland police officers. The Portland Police Bureau must comply with all local and federal laws in their work in collaboration with the JTTF. This includes ORS 181A-250, which prevents the Portland Police Bureau and as well as other police municipal police agencies from collecting or maintaining information about the political, religious, or social views, as well as any information about the associations or activities of any individual. Even when Portland police officers are working with the JTTF, they must comply with this law. The law's purpose was to place safeguards on civilians' privacy as well as their civil liberties. But the FBI does not operate under this law or under a comparable law or policy. And Portland police officers working as JTT officers may be engaged in actions that are in direct conflict with this law. The most direct way to prevent civil rights abuses and potential state law violations is for the city to prohibit Portland Police Bureau officers from participating with the JTTF. However, to the extent that the Bureau continues to have engagement with the JTTF, it is critical for the city to create meaningful oversight and transparency. To do this, the city needs to continue to require Portland Police Bureau to provide consistent and timely reports with meaningful information about its activities with the JTTF. As well, the city should create a community-focused oversight structure for Portland Police Bureau's participation in the JTTF. Without an oversight and transparency structure, the safeguards that ORS 181A-250 offers and the civil rights protections of all Portlanders are at risk. The draft report the City Council will review tomorrow is insufficient as it does little to shed light on PPBA interactions with the JTTF. We will encourage the council to reject this draft report and ask the Portland Police Bureau to provide more transparency. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, I would like to invite Brandon Mayfield, a local attorney and survivor of illegal FBI spying.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Give me just a second. I've got it. Okay, there my video popped up. Thank you, Jasmine, and salam alaikum. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to share with the media and others who are interested. I want to let everybody know that JTTFs, as Mariana has said, have historically targeted minority groups, including Muslims, social activists, and more recently, African Americans protesting for civil rights. The new JTTF report, 2022 report, sadly, is more of the same. I was personally wrongfully arrested in 2004 in connection with the Madrid, Spain bombing. And I and my family were targeted by the Portland police working with the JTTF in 2004. They followed me and gathered information about when I came and went from a local area mosque, even though they had no evidence I'd committed a crime. All of the reasons in support of my false arrest were tied to my being Muslim and my Muslim associations. A recent leak by hackers of the DC Police Department Intelligence Bureau's emails revealed that they, the JTTF, which works with Homeland Security Bureau, closely watched and tracked Black-led organizations and anti-racist groups for years while ignoring the growing right-wing threat. Errol Southers, a professor and former FBI agent, said, for the last decade, more than 76% of the domestic attacks in this country, resulting in fatalities, have been at the hands of the right wing. The threat to Americans by political or social activist groups like BLM or Muslims has always been virtually non-existent. On average, since 1995, over 15 Americans are killed in terrorist attacks worldwide. And yet today, over 95,000 Americans overdose on drugs each year and 40,000 are killed by gun violence. In Portland alone, last year, 92 people were killed in homicides, most of them drug-related. And according to the CDC, over 500 people die by gun-related violence and over 500 from drug overdoses in Oregon alone last year. And yet, curiously, in its report, the city and the PPB somehow found it necessary to spend more than half of its 2.5-page conclusion in traditional Islamophobic fear-mongering fashion, citing the distant future hypothetical threat that Al-Qaeda and ISIS still pose to us following the military withdrawal of troops in Afghanistan last August. They do so, and they did so in the report, citing to a single CBS report and a summary of a 2001 DHS threat bulletin that takes it out of context. The JTTF report fails to mention the part of the DHS bulletin that says it's actually American Muslims who are more likely to be at risk following the withdrawal. And it fails to mention that part of the CBS report that says the Taliban is likely to neutralize both ISIS and Al-Qaeda from being operational following the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. I think the city, the state, even the country, to some extent, are clued out as to where the real threat is coming from. It's not Al-Qaeda or ISIS. The truth is the real threat is guns, drugs, gun violence, and the rise in white extremism. However, I want to be clear that I and this group that I'm a part of, even though white extremist attacks and deaths have been rising, it does not justify compromising our civil liberties. Law enforcement agencies should not be tracking or investigating people or organizations, no matter what their backgrounds or personal beliefs, unless there's probable cause that they're engaged in criminal activities. For these reasons, I advocate again, as I have in the past, for withdrawing completely from the JTTF, even on a case-by-case basis, and or at a minimum to revise it so it's actually in keeping with the Fourth Amendment and ORS 181A 250, as Mariana had pointed out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brandon. Next, we will hear from Marlene Walgenford from Portland Japanese American Citizen League.
I'm not able to start my video, but I can speak. Okay. As a member of the Portland JCL, a civil rights organization, I would strongly urge the Portland Police Bureau to stop all cooperation with the Joint Terrorism Task Force. So it's ironic that although the FBI is charged with protecting the civil liberties of Americans, it has a long history of violating our constitutionally protected rights. Even though investigation by the agency found no evidence of sabotage among Japanese Americans during World War II, they targeted the Japanese because of their ethnic heritage. Community leaders like civil rights icons Martin Luther King and Malcolm X were surveilled and monitored because of their calls for change. Now, according to an investigation by the New York Times published last December, agents from the FBI were dressed in plain clothes and embedded in Portland's racial justice protests beginning in July of 2020. The FBI had officers in the protests walking alongside activists, recording the scenes of the day and alerting local police to potential threats. Also, the U.S. Supreme Court has heard arguments in November 2021 in a case involving an FBI undercover operation at a mosque in California. Area Muslims are suing the FBI for over a nearly year-long surveillance program that publicly yielded no results. The FBI is attempting to use the national security as an excuse to dodge accountability. This is no different than World War II when the Issei men were arrested and one man was accused of planning to blow up the Panama Canal on the basis of his daughter's drawing of the canal for a school assignment. The only evidence for the arrest was the suspicion that because of their bloodline, he was genetically predisposed to be loyal to Japan. In the aftermath of 9/11, the US government targeted Muslims in the name of national security. And as Brandon Mayfield described, it was an example of what fear and suspicion can do because of his religion can do to our civil rights. So we've recently viewed the annual report by the Portland Police Bureau. And as with previous year's reports, there's very little information is given, and there's no way for the general public to know how the incidents or concerns came to the attention of the FBI or the Portland Police. We've been told that cooperating with a federal agency, the Portland Police can monitor their work. So there's no way that our local police can have any control over FBI practices. So it's time that we divest our community from an agency that has such a clouded history of upholding our constitutionally protected rights. The FBI needs to reflect upon its culture of white supremacy. And for example, there was no evidence that the FBI was monitoring the activities of the Trump supporters that stormed the Capitol on January 6th. And has even stated that they were completely unaware that there was any threat at all. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Lastly, we will hear from Anais Tippeker from 350 PDX.
Thank you, Jasmine, and thank you, members of the press who are here. So I am representing 350 PDX, which is a local organization that seeks to build and support a diverse grassroots climate justice movement. We believe addressing the climate crisis will require centering the needs of frontline communities in our campaigns and programs, with all of us acting as co-conspirators for social and racial justice. I'm really here, though, not just as a representative of an organization, but as a member of a community that I deeply love and have connection with and respect for. And you might call that the climate justice community in Portland and across the state. So coming from that place, there are two things that I want to stress to frame these brief comments we have about the JTTF report and Portland's continuing cooperation with the FBI. One, people in Oregon who are concerned about the climate crisis recognize that the economy we have right now has to be radically transformed. Motivating a large enough chunk of people to commit to that transformation is going to mean going up against powerful economic interests with a lot of political influence and saying things and taking actions that do not threaten our safety, but that do challenge our complacency. I deeply believe, and this is my second point, from my personal experience, that we all benefit from the continued involvement of leaders from frontline communities. That means those impacted first and worst by the climate crisis, people of color, Black, Indigenous communities, people from low income and rural communities. We all benefit from the continued involvement of leaders from frontline communities who are already committing their energy and brilliance to finding climate solutions. We need to do all we can to support the activism of new people wanting to come into movement and civic engagement from those communities as well. So when the JTTF report tells us with very minimal detail that there were fewer than 10 cases referred between PPB and the FBI in either direction in 2021, my concerns are not assuaged because the possibility of covert surveillance remains real for this climate community. And that possibility chills people's willingness to take action of any kind, no matter how constitutionally guaranteed it might be. Specific surveillance of environmental and climate activists is real. We know from multiple articles in The Guardian that have been referenced in past years that fusion centers and the FBI are actively surveilling climate activists in Oregon. As was just mentioned, the New York Times recently reported that the FBI was covertly surveilling local activists during the 2020 and 2021 Portland protests in support of Black lives and against police violence. Racial justice and climate justice are different threads in the same struggle against systems that depend on valuing some lives, especially Black and Brown and Indigenous lives, less than others, so that they can go on extracting resources for profit. The impact of the threat of surveillance is especially strong for people who live their lives knowing that racial or class privilege will not protect them. When Black people, Indigenous people, people of color, people who are immigrants and refugees, people of Muslim and other than Christian faiths have to choose whether they will step up to speak publicly about the climate crisis or other social justice crises, the fear of surveillance may stop them, and that is both an infringement on their rights and a loss to us all. This is one key reason why Oregon revised statutes that have already been referenced by the ACLU and other speakers restrict the collection of information of individuals or organizations on their views, associations, or activities, unless there are reasonable grounds to suspect criminal involvement. But again, as has already been noted, the FBI is not bound by this statute, which means they could gather information that would be illegal for Oregon law enforcement to gather, and then they can share it with Portland Police Bureau. Our city policies across all areas are better and stronger when every Portlander has a voice and a chance to give input. I have heard our city councilors say this in the past in one way or another. So I'm asking them to consider what it takes to make space for all voices truly possible, especially the voices of those who know that police surveillance is no rare occurrence and not a joking matter. It only takes a moment to label someone advocating for change as a threat, and we need people to advocate for change. I urge the City Council to continue restricting the amplification of biased and fearful impressions, and to, wherever possible, limit police and FBI authority for surveillance of Portlanders and all people in our region. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of our speakers today. Again, I want to remind folks to please tune in tomorrow to the City Council at 10 a.m., where they will be giving the report on the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Now I'd like to open the floor for the next 9 or so minutes for any questions from the press. And then media, feel free to unmute if you do have any questions.
I'll ask a question since no one is. This is Maxine Bernstein from the Oregonian. So a frequent criticism of this report is that it lacks critical information. What specific information do you think should be in those reports?
If any of the speakers would like to answer, feel free to unmute yourself.
Maxine, this is Brandon. So I don't know if I can address your question directly, but I can say, as I had mentioned earlier, I think some of the information that they have is taken out of context. For example, I had cited CBS News report that the report cited, but it took it out of context, again, making it seem as if the threat was Al-Qaeda or ISIS, when even that, the very news report that they cited, you look at the very end, they concluded, almost otherwise. And if you just look at the section of the report from the Department of Homeland Security's bulletin, the part that they cited, the summary, it leaves out the details. If you go to the actual DHS bulletin, you'll see down there that the real threat from the pullout from Afghanistan, which was mentioned directly in the report, it wasn't there was going to be a threat to Portlanders or Oregonians or Americans generally. The real threat was to American Muslims who might be targeted by racially motivated, ethnically motivated extremists. And that was in the report itself, and yet it takes it out of context. So I would appreciate that they include that. And another thing they left out, even though they mentioned domestic violent extremists, there as a threat, they lumped it together with anarchists, for example, along with white supremacists, white wing extremists. They lump in Antifa and left-wing groups, and yet one of the statistics they cited said they've only conducted one fatality since 9/11. That is left-wing groups, as opposed to right wings, which have enacted the most fatalities since 9/11, and even more recently, since 2016, they left out any reference to how since 2016, almost 2/3 of the fatalities are by the right wing. So I think it's just they're cherry picking the information they want to use. So that's what I would want to see in there, and a little bit more of a balanced approach. So thank you for your question. I hope that answers it in part.
Thank you so much, Brandon. Any other questions, or would any of the speakers like to answer the questions that was brought up by Maxine?
I have this is Anais. I could just quickly add, Brandon's answer was great, and there's also some stuff in the chat. I think it would also be good to have more information about the actual sources, some more detailed information, because I think we could then see, kind of like Brandon is saying, that often it's out of context or not really a threat. An example I think of is the surveillance that we know of, again, from reporting in The Guardian about climate activists in Southern Oregon. Often those fusion centers were collecting information that was perfectly openly available, from social media about where people were going to be gathering and what they were going to be doing. Perfectly legitimate activity, but it was being collected and presented in a way that suggested that this was somehow threatening. And so I think if the public knew more about the sources, we could assess for ourselves whether these were legitimate threats in a better way.
Thank you so much. And then just reading from the chat, the nature of closed cases referred from the Portland Police Bureau to the FBI. including the demographics of person investigated and the disportation, I cannot say this word for some reason. Disportation. I cannot say this word. Of those cases, disposition, thank you, of those cases, which will apply to any case handled before the end of cooperations. Oral public testimony taken when the 2020 report is made in January, as indicated in our coalition letters. And that this, I want to remind folks as well, this is the first time since this new case-by-case relationship has been established that the public is actually able to give testimony on these reports. We only have about 3 more minutes left. If there is one other question someone's dying to ask, please unmute yourself now and ask that. And then I will mute to give space. Okay, I would like to thank the members of the press for joining us today and taking the time to listen to us. Thank you all who tuned in live from our live stream. Again, just a couple more reminders. Tomorrow we will be hearing the report at the City Council at 10 a.m., where we will also be giving testimony as well. And thank you all again for being here.